The dust in the basement of the old St. Jude's Academy did not behave like ordinary dust. It was heavy, metallic, and seemed to cling to the skin with a purposeful intent. I found the first ledger beneath a collapsed floorboard in the boiler room, tucked away where the moisture couldn't reach it, but where no living eye was meant to see it. It was a simple attendance record from 1892, but the names were wrong. Not the surnames, which were the familiar Anglo and Germanic iterations of the era, but the curriculum noted in the margins. It didn't speak of arithmetic or the rise of the industrial age. It spoke of atmospheric energy. It spoke of star forts as batteries. It spoke of a world that existed before the Great Reset of the mid-19th century. Ask yourself why a parochial school in the middle of a flyover state would be teaching 12-year-olds about the wireless transmission of power decades before Tesla's Wardenclyffe. Ask yourself why every page following the winter of 1893 had been meticulously excised with a razor. This was not a fire. This was not a flood. This was an erasure. I sat in that dark, damp space and realized that the history we are fed is not a record of events, but a curated garden pruned by unseen hands to ensure we never see the forest for the trees. I moved through the corridors of the abandoned institution, my flashlight cutting through the stagnant air. The architecture itself was a riddle. The school was officially built in 1888, yet the foundation stones were weathered in a way that suggested centuries of exposure. Huge, oversized doorways stood blocked by haphazardly laid brick, reduced to the standard height of a modern man. Why build so tall if the residents were small? Why use granite blocks weighing several tons for a simple country schoolhouse? The official records call it Romanesque revival. They use labels to stifle curiosity. If you give a mystery a name, people stop asking questions. But the load distribution of these arches suggests they were designed to support far more than a slate roof. They were designed for something heavy, something industrial, something that was removed before the photographers arrived. I traced the outlines of the bricked-up windows and felt the cold vibration of a hidden frequency. Not a building, not a school, a remnant. The curriculum change wasn't gradual. According to the fragmentary notes I recovered from the St. Jude's archive, the order came from the Department of Education in a single week, a standardization of historical narrative, they called it. Teachers who refused to comply didn't just lose their jobs, they vanished from the census. I found a letter from a headmaster, Josiah Thorne, addressed to his wife. He wrote of men in dark coats who arrived by train to confiscate the maps. He described them burning the globes in the courtyard, globes that showed a landmass in the north called Tartaria, a sprawling empire that supposedly didn't exist in the 19th century. Thorne's letter ended mid-sentence. His name does not appear in any cemetery record in the state. What if the schools weren't just teaching history? What if they were the front lines of a memory war? We are told that the past is a solid thing, a foundation upon which the present is built. But what if the foundation is a hollow shell, and we are merely living in the ruins of a civilization that was dismantled while our ancestors watched in silence? I followed the trail of the Redistribution of Knowledge Act to the state capital, a city that, like so many others, seems to have been built overnight with an impossible level of grandeur. The marble columns and gilded domes of the Capitol building look less like the work of a horse and buggy settlers and more like the scavenged tech of a fallen giant. I spent weeks in the sub-basements of the State Library, navigating through miles of microfiche. The pattern emerged with terrifying clarity. Between 1870 and 1910, hundreds of schools across the continent were shuttered for renovation. When they reopened, the libraries had been purged, the maps of the old world were gone, the stories of the mud flood were dismissed as folklore, the technology of the old world was reclassified as magic or myth. I found a map from 1850 that showed the entire interior of the American West dotted with massive star-shaped cities. By the 1880 map, these cities had been replaced by uncharted territory. Institutional gatekeeping is not just about hiding books. It is about rewriting the landscape so that you cannot even trust your own eyes. The erasure trope is a powerful tool because it relies on the arrogance of the present. We are taught to believe we are the pinnacle of human achievement. We are taught that the people who came before us were primitive, superstitious, and lived in the dirt. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The buildings we call historical landmarks are often just the repurposed husks of a much older, much more advanced global network. In the basement of St. Jude's, I found a series of copper plates that looked like circuit boards. They were labelled as instructional aids for atmospheric resonance. They had been discarded alongside broken desks and rusted pipes. If the schools were ordered to stop teaching about this, it means the power was real. It means the energy was free. And free energy is the one thing that an empire cannot allow its subjects to have. Control over the narrative is control over the resource, not wealth, not land, information. What if the light bulbs in our houses are just a pale imitation of the brilliance that once lit the streets of the world? I stood in the centre of the old gymnasium, the floorboards groaning under my boots. The ceiling was a masterpiece of ironwork, forming a geometric pattern that mirrored the layout of the Great Pyramid. This wasn't aesthetics, it was engineering. I looked at the walls where the plaster had peeled away, revealing the red brick beneath. Every school from this era is built of the same red brick. Thousands of them appearing simultaneously across the globe, from San Francisco to Moscow, from Melbourne to London. They call it the Industrial Revolution. I call it the Great Inheritance. We didn't build these cities, we found them. We moved in, cleaned off the mud, and pretended we laid the bricks ourselves. The schools were the most important part of the takeover. You have to train the children to believe the lie, or the lie won't survive the generation. Ask yourself, why does every old school feel like a fortress? Why are the windows so high? Why are the basements so deep? The deeper I dug into the thorn papers, the more I realised that the Tartarian curriculum wasn't just about geography. It was about a different way of being human. It spoke of a world without borders, where the Grand Tartary acted as a custodian of global harmony. It described a system of resonant healing conducted through the cathedrals, which were actually power stations, and the star forts, which were actually frequency modulators. The schools were teaching children how to interact with the Earth's magnetic field. This is why the crackdown was so severe. This wasn't a disagreement over dates and kings. This was the total suppression of a superior science, not this science of pills and wires, not this science of scarcity. Something else, something that made the individual sovereign. I found a charred textbook fragment that described the ether as a living substance. In modern physics, the ether is a joke. In the 19th century classroom, it was the breath of the world. The pattern is not limited to the United States. I travelled to the ruins of a colonial school in India, then to a decommissioned academy in the heart of Germany. The architectural DNA is identical, the same heavy masonry, the same oversized hallways, the same peculiar copper finials on the roofs. Everywhere, the story is the same. The old books were burned, the old teachers were replaced, and a new, truncated history was installed. This is the global pattern of institutional erasure. They didn't just hide the truth, they made the truth look like madness. If you speak of Tartaria today, you are labelled a conspiracy theorist. You are told that the maps were just errors made by incompetent cartographers. You are told that the massive buildings were unnecessary flourishes by eccentric architects. But why would every architect in every country be eccentric in the exact same way at the exact same time? The scale of the deception is so vast that the mind instinctively rejects it. That is their greatest shield. I returned to the St. Jude's basement one last time, hoping to find the final piece of the Thorn puzzle. I found a hidden compartment behind a lead-lined cabinet. Inside was a single photograph dated August 1894. It showed the student body standing in front of the school. They weren't wearing the ragged clothes of the period. They were wearing white silk garments that seemed to shimmer even in the grainy black and white image. Behind them, the school's towers were topped with glowing spheres, actual, visible light without wires. The caption on the back read, "The last day of the sun." This was the moment the switch was flipped. This was the moment the world went dark and the modern age began. The schools were the first to fall because they were the keepers of the light. Once the children were taught to fear the dark, they could be sold the candle. Once they were taught that the past was empty, they could be sold a fake future. The unresolved loop haunts me. If the empire of Tartaria was so vast and its technology so advanced, how did it fall? How does a global civilization get buried under 6 feet of mud and forgotten in the span of a single lifetime? The answer lies in the silence of the schools. It lies in the way we are taught to look at a beautiful old building and see only art instead of machinery. It lies in the way we are taught to never, ever ask what is beneath the basement of our own history. We are the survivors of a cataclysm we aren't allowed to remember. We are the orphans of a golden age, living in the attic of our ancestors' mansion, told to stay in the corner and play with our plastic toys. Ask yourself, if the truth were simple, would they have worked so hard to hide it? What if the world you know is just a shadow cast by the one they took away? The investigation is not over. It is only beginning. Because once you see the pattern, you can never unsee it. You see it in the bricks, you see it in the stars, you see it in the eyes of everyone who knows the truth but is too afraid to speak. The silence that followed the seizure of the academies was not a void but a frequency. I began to track the displacement of the unaligned scholars, those teachers from the 1890s who refused to burn their ledgers. They didn't all vanish. Some were moved to sanitariums, institutions that appeared with suspicious frequency alongside the new public school system. I found the medical records for a woman named Elena Vance, a geography mistress at a demolished Starfort school in upstate New York. Her diagnosis was chronic imaginative hysteria, a common label for anyone who insisted that the Great Lakes were not natural formations but flooded excavations of a previous age. Her notes, scrawled on the back of hospital intake forms, spoke of the resonance of the 1870s, a period she claimed was characterized by a global humming that preceded the arrival of the mud. She wrote that the schools were ordered to stop teaching because the children were beginning to hear it. Not a sound, not a voice, a vibration that aligned the crystalline structure of the blood. Ask yourself why the modern classroom is designed with fluorescent lights and right angles that disrupt natural biorhythms. What if the architecture of the old schools was designed to amplify human consciousness and the new architecture is designed to suppress it? I travelled to the site of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the white city that they tell us was built of plaster and wood in a mere 2 years. It is the ultimate example of the erasure trope. They built a sprawling neoclassical metropolis with advanced electrical lighting and massive water features, only to dynamite it and burn it to the ground the moment the fair ended. The official narrative says it was temporary. The logic of the investigator says that is a lie. You do not build massive, load-bearing stone foundations for a temporary exhibit. You do not install miles of copper piping for a 3-month show. The fair wasn't a celebration of progress. It was a fire sale of a conquered civilization's assets. The schools were brought there by the trainload to see the future, when in reality they were being shown the last remnants of the past before it was liquidated. I found a map of the fairgrounds in an old janitor's closet in a nearby library. It didn't match the official blueprints. It showed tunnels extending miles out into the lake, tunnels that were already centuries old by 1893. Institutional gatekeeping ensures that we only see the fair, never the infrastructure that sat beneath it. The transition from the old world curriculum to the standardized curriculum coincided with the rise of the great philanthropic foundations. These organizations didn't just fund schools, they bought the right to define reality. They introduced the concept of the linear timeline, a neat ascending staircase of human progress that conveniently placed the current power structure at the top. To do this, they had to remove the Great Tartary from the maps. They had to rebrand the global architectural style as Renaissance Revival or Classical Eclecticism. They turned a unified, high-tech, global civilization into a series of disconnected primitive tribes who somehow all decided to build the exact same massive stone cathedrals at the same time. It is a statistical impossibility. The load distribution of a cathedral is identical to the load distribution of a power plant. If you remove the altar and look at the geometry, the deception becomes transparent. The schools were the delivery mechanism for this cognitive dissonance. They taught us to admire the beauty so we would never question the function. In a forgotten archive in Brussels, I found a series of telegrams between the heads of various European education boards and their counterparts in the Americas. They were dated 1902. The subject was the eradication of the etheric theory. One telegram was particularly chilling. It stated, "The youth must be tethered to the earth. If they believe the energy is in the air, we cannot tax it. If they believe the history is in the stone, we cannot rewrite it." This was the smoking gun. The shift in physics from ether-based energy to the scarcity-based model of thermodynamics was a political decision, not a scientific one. The schools were the laboratories for this social engineering. They replaced the study of the infinite with the study of the finite. They took the Grand Tartary off the globe and replaced it with a series of warring nation states. They fractured the human family so we would be easier to manage. Not this unity, not that peace, something else. A manufactured chaos designed to keep us from looking up at the spires and wondering what they were actually for. The physical evidence of the mud flood is visible in every major city if you know where to look. I stood in front of a primary school in London where the first floor windows were half buried in the earth, their ornate stone archways disappearing into the pavement. The official explanation is light wells. They want us to believe that 19th century architects, in their infinite wisdom, decided to build the most decorative parts of their buildings underground where no one could see them, and then dug holes so a tiny bit of light could reach the windows. It is an absurdity that we accept because the alternative is too frightening. The alternative is that the ground level of our world rose by 10 to 20 feet in a very short period. This is the Great Reset that Thorne hinted at in his letters. The schools were ordered to stop teaching Tartaria because Tartaria was the world before the mud. To acknowledge the empire is to acknowledge the cataclysm, and to acknowledge the cataclysm is to admit that our current leaders are not the rightful heirs, but the looters who crawled out of the wreckage. I began to look for the redistribution centres, the places where the children of the old world were taken after the schools were purged. I found them under the guise of orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were moved across the United States. Where did they come from? Why were there so many orphans in a time of supposed prosperity? The official history blames poverty and disease, but the records at the receiving end of the trains show children who were well fed, educated, and spoke multiple languages. These weren't the children of the slums. These were the children of the old world whose parents had been liquidated during the transition. They were shipped to the West, given new names, and taught the new history. They were the blank slates upon which the new empire was written. The schools were the finishing schools for this mass erasure. If you want to steal a world, you don't kill the children. You just tell them their parents never existed. In the mid-20s, the final phase of the erasure was completed. The last of the teachers who remembered the atmospheric resonance curriculum had retired or died. The textbooks had been fully replaced with the standardized versions. The star forts had been converted into prisons or parks, their internal machinery stripped and sold for scrap. I found a diary of a young girl from this era, a student at one of the newly reformed academies. She wrote about a forbidden room in the back of the library where the old books were kept behind a locked iron door. She described sneaking in and seeing a map of the world where the oceans were filled with cities and the poles were tropical. She wrote that when she asked her teacher about it, she was told she had a fever and was sent to the infirmary for a week. When she returned, the iron door had been bricked over. This is how the old world died, not with a bang, but with a bricked-up door and a medical diagnosis. The architectural contrast between the old world schools and the new world schools is a physical manifestation of the psychic shift. The old schools were built of stone and brick, designed to last for 1,000 years, filled with light and air and sacred geometry. The new schools, built after the 1920s, are increasingly functional, sterile, and prison-like. They are designed for load distribution of a different kind, the distribution of a compliant workforce. The Grand Tartary was a civilization of creators. The new empire is a civilization of consumers. By removing the knowledge of our true heritage, they removed our sense of worth. If we believe we came from nothing, we will accept anything. But the stone remembers, the brick remembers. Even if the schools are ordered to stop teaching it, the information is encoded in the very walls. Every time you walk past an old building with buried windows, you are walking past a piece of the true cross. I found a final entry in the hidden Thorne papers, a scrap of parchment that seemed to have been written in great haste. It wasn't a letter. It was a set of coordinates and a single sentence. The frequency is not gone, it is only muted. I realized then that the schools weren't just teaching about the energy, They were part of the grid. The entire network of Tartarian buildings was a global machine, a harmonious system that maintained the equilibrium of the planet. When the schools were ordered to stop teaching the resonance, the machine began to break down. The wars, the droughts, the natural disasters of the 20th century, these aren't random events. They are the symptoms of a world out of tune. We are living in a house where the electricity has been cut off, and we are trying to light the rooms with matches, unaware that the master switch is right behind the wallpaper. The unresolved philosophical open loop remains. If we are the product of an engineered amnesia, who are we really? If the history of the last 200 years is a fiction, what is the truth of our potential? The schools that were ordered to stop teaching Tartaria weren't just hiding a name on a map. They were hiding the fact that we are a species capable of greatness without permission. They were hiding the fact that the earth provides everything we need for free, if we only know how to listen to the stone. The investigator's journey doesn't end with a conclusion, but with a realization. The evidence is not in the books. The evidence is in the silence between the words. It is in the way your heart beats faster when you stand in the shadow of a classical ruin. It is the recognition of a home you were told never existed. Ask yourself, if the past is a lie, what does that make the present? What if the great reset is not a historical event, but an ongoing process? And what if the only way to stop it is to remember? The 10th part of the Thorn Papers was not a document at all, but a schematic etched into the underside of a mahogany teacher's desk, preserved by the very darkness that sought to bury it. It was a map of the local ley lines, intersecting precisely at the points where the suppressed academies once stood. I traced the lines with my fingers, feeling the phantom pulse of a network that still whispered beneath the concrete of our modern cities. The schools were not merely buildings, they were the nodes of a terrestrial nervous system. When the instruction came to cease the teaching of the old ways, it was a command to sever the connection between the human mind and the planetary core. We were being unplugged. I realized then that the Great Reset was not an act of God or nature, but a deliberate mechanical bypass. They replaced the natural resonance of the earth with the artificial hum of the power grid, a frequency that keeps us in a state of perpetual low-level anxiety. Not this peace, not that clarity. Something else, a manufactured dissonance. I stood in the graveyard of St. Jude's, looking out over the town that had grown up around the ruins, oblivious to the titan sleeping in its soil. The institutional gatekeeping had been so successful that the people living here viewed the school's strange architecture as a quaint mystery rather than a crime scene. They walked past the red brick bastions and the copper-clad towers and saw only history, a word that has become a synonym for dead and irrelevant. But the architecture is not dead, it is waiting. The load distribution of the old world was designed to withstand a weight we no longer understand, the weight of a fully realized human spirit. The curriculum of Tartaria was not about facts, it was about the technology of the soul. By removing that knowledge, they didn't just take away our past, they took away our gravity. We are floating in a void of manufactured crises, unable to anchor ourselves, because we have been taught that the anchor is a myth. The final irony of the investigation is that the evidence is too large to be seen. It is the scale of the deception that protects it. We can conceive of a small lie, a forged signature, a hidden bank account, but we cannot conceive of a lie that encompasses the entire globe, a lie that spans centuries, a lie that involves the systematic remodeling of the very earth we walk upon. We are like ants crawling across a circuit board, convinced that the copper traces are natural valleys and the transistors are mountains. The schools were the first layer of the simulation. They taught us how to perceive the board so that we would never recognize the circuit. Ask yourself, Thorne had written in his final frantic note, what happens when the battery is empty? We are living in the dying embers of that atmospheric charge, using the last of the stolen light to search for the switch. The unresolved philosophical open loop is the nature of our own compliance. Why did we let them take it? Why did the teachers burn the books? Why did the parents allow the orphan trains to depart? Perhaps the Great Reset was not forced upon us, but offered as a bargain. Scarcity is easier than sovereignty. It is simpler to be a cog in a machine you don't understand than to be a master of a power you cannot control. The empire of Tartaria may have fallen not because it was conquered, but because it became too heavy for a shrinking humanity to carry. We chose the darkness because the light was too demanding. Now, as the artificial grid begins to flicker and the modern age reveals its fragility, the old stones are beginning to hum again. The schools are silent, but the ground is not. The investigation leads us back to the start, to the dust, to the brick, and to the terrifying possibility that the truth is not hidden in a vault, but hiding in plain sight. What if the door is already unlocked? What if the only thing keeping us in the dark is the fear of what we will see when we turn on the light? The silence of the modern schoolyard is a manufactured product, a specific acoustic profile designed to replace the resonance of the old world. I stood on the cracked asphalt of a contemporary playground, looking at the utilitarian box of a 1970s extension grafted onto the side of a red brick Titan. The contrast was not merely aesthetic, it was biological. The old stone breathed, the new concrete choked. I found the maintenance logs for this district, dating back to the transition period of the 1920s, hidden in a flooded crawl space. They didn't speak of repairs. They spoke of neutralization. They were ordered to remove the iron rods that ran from the roof crests deep into the water tables. They were ordered to paint over the gold leaf ceilings with lead-based grey. This was not a modernization effort. This was a grounding. They were cutting the antennas. Ask yourself why the most beautiful buildings in your city are almost always the post offices, the courthouses, and the schools built before 1910. Ask yourself why we stopped building with that level of intent, not this budget, not that style, something else. A mandate to ensure that no child would ever again feel the atmospheric charge of a resonant chamber. The institutional gatekeeping of our universities is the final sentry at the gate of memory. I interviewed a retired professor of archaeology who spoke only on the condition of absolute anonymity, his voice trembling as he described the black box finds of the mid-century. He spoke of excavations in the Ohio Valley, where they found not primitive burials, but pressurized steam systems and copper-lined conduits that predated the arrival of the pioneers by centuries. These findings were not published. They were not debated. They were crated and shipped to the Smithsonian, where they entered the unclassified void. The professor called it the geographic lobotomy. If you remove the physical evidence of a superior predecessor, you make the current occupants feel like the pinnacle of evolution. The schools were the primary instruments of this psychological operation. They taught us that the mounds were trash heaps, and the star forts were defensive works against bows and arrows. They turned high technology into primitive superstition so that we would never go looking for the power source. I traced the Resonance Act to a series of closed-door sessions in the early Federal Reserve meetings. It turns out the bankers were more interested in the schools than the gold. They knew that a population that could pull energy from the air could never be debt slaves. They funded the creation of the General Education Board to ensure that the Tartarian curriculum was replaced with industrial literacy. They didn't want thinkers, they wanted operators. They didn't want poets of the ether, they wanted clerks of the ledger. I found a memo from 1914 that stated, "We shall not permit the youth to believe the earth is a battery. They must believe it is a mine." This shift in perspective changed everything. It turned the world from a living organism into a corpse to be dissected for profit. The schools were the morgues where the spirit of the old world was laid to rest. We are the descendants of the people who were taught to be afraid of the lightning. The architecture of the reset is nowhere more apparent than in the sanitariums that were built to house the unfit. I visited the ruins of the Danvers State Hospital, a Gothic nightmare that looked more like a palace than a prison. Why waste such grandeur on the mad? Unless they weren't mad, unless they were the ones who refused to forget. I found records of re-education cycles where patients were forced to recite the new history of the Americas until they could no longer remember the names of the star cities. This was the soft liquidation. If you couldn't be folded into the new workforce, you were stored in a stone box until you expired. The schools and the asylums were two sides of the same coin, one for the compliant, one for the resistant. Both were designed to ensure that the secret of the Grand Tartary died with that generation. What if the mental health crisis of the modern era is actually the suppressed memory of a world that functioned in harmony with the cosmos? The mud flood evidence in the heart of the Eurasian continent is even more staggering than in the Americas. I travelled to the outskirts of St. Petersburg, a city that officially rose from a swamp in a few decades, yet contains granite monoliths that modern cranes struggle to lift. The schools there were the first to be cleansed by the imperial decrees. They were ordered to stop teaching the history of the Great Scythia and the Tartarian Khanate. They were told that their ancestors were nomadic barbarians, despite the fact that they lived in cities with heated floors and wireless telegraphy. This is the erasure trope on a continental scale. They turned a global trade empire into a collection of Dark Age myths. I saw the buried ground floors of the Winter Palace, where the windows peek out from the dirt like the eyes of a giant buried alive. Not this flood, not that disaster, something else. A global repositioning of the Earth's crust that the schools were ordered to call architectural fashion. The technology of the old world was not just about power, it was about the distribution of information through the very air we breathe. I found a reference in a 1884 science manual to the Universal Library of the Sky, a method of encoding data into the etheric field. The schools were once the terminals for this library. The children didn't just read books, they tuned in to the collective knowledge of the civilization. When the order came to dismantle the terminals, the human mind was effectively isolated. We went from a wireless, interconnected species to a fragmented, analog one. This is why we feel so lonely in the modern world. We are missing our connection to the source. The schools now teach us that the brain is a computer made of meat, isolated in a skull of bone. They have trapped us in the main single-user mode of existence so that they can sell us the network through a glass screen. I returned to the site of the St. Jude's boiler room where I had found the first ledger. I noticed something I had missed before. The bricks behind the boiler weren't just red, they were translucent when hit with a certain frequency of light. They weren't clay, They were a synthetic ceramic metal composite. This school wasn't built, it was grown or printed. This realization shattered my remaining understanding of the 19th century. If they had the tech to print buildings in 1880, why are we still stacking bricks by hand in 2026? The answer is institutional gatekeeping. If the people knew how easy it was to create, they wouldn't work 40 hours a week for a mortgage. The schools were ordered to stop teaching the material science of the ancients because it made the entire economic system obsolete. We are living in a manufactured scarcity enforced by a history that tells us everything is hard, everything is rare, and everything has a price. The orphan trains were the final harvest. I tracked a group of children who were sent to a remote agricultural school in the plains. This school had no books, it had no maps, it had only practical labour. These children were the pioneers of the New West, but they were pioneers without a past. They were told the ruins they saw on the horizon were natural rock formations or Indian burial grounds. They were the first generation to grow up entirely within the lie. They became the parents of the 20th century, passing down a void where a heritage should have been. I found a photo of one of these agricultural classes. The children's eyes were vacant, as if the light of the Grand Tartary had been surgically removed. This is the true meaning of the reset. It is the systematic replacement of a high-functioning humanity with a low-functioning one. The unresolved philosophical open loop is the question of the next reset. If the cycle of erasure is a feature of our reality, are we currently approaching the end of our own standardized era? The artificial grid is failing. The linear timeline is crumbling under the weight of its own inconsistencies. The schools are losing their grip on the narrative as the digital ether begins to leak the old truths. We are standing at the same threshold that Josiah Thorne stood at in 1893. We can feel the hum returning. We can see the buried windows. We can hear the whisper of the Grand Tartary in the static of our devices. The question is not whether the truth will come out, but whether we will be strong enough to believe it when it does. Are we ready to be the heirs of the giants, or have we become too comfortable in the shadows? The investigation concludes not with an answer, but with a challenge. Look at the schools, look at the post offices, look at the cathedrals, see the machinery beneath the masonry, recognise the frequency beneath the silence. The schools were ordered to stop teaching Tartaria because the name itself is a key. It unlocks the door to a room where we are not small, we are not weak, and we are not alone. The Great Reset only works if we agree to forget. But the stone does not forget, the water does not forget, and somewhere deep in the marrow of your bones, you do not forget either. The investigation is now yours. Ask yourself, what if you are the one they were trying to prevent? What if the forbidden knowledge is simply the realization that you were never meant to be a slave to the light bulb? Next step. Would you like me to continue with parts 21 through 30? The resonance of the St. Jude's basement was not an isolated acoustic fluke, but a localized symptom of a continental fracture. I moved my investigation toward the high deserts of the American Southwest, where the official narrative of primitive cliff dwellings began to dissolve under the scrutiny of structural load distribution. I found a retired surveyor for the railway who had spent 40 years mapping the gradients of the Four Corners region. He didn't speak of indigenous migration patterns. He spoke of vitrified canals. He showed me topographical maps from 1912 that had been suppressed by the Department of the Interior, maps that depicted a massive geometric irrigation grid connecting the pueblos in a way that mirrored the circuit boards of the mid-19th century. The schools in this region were the most aggressive in their erasure. They were ordered to teach that the massive stone towers were granaries for a civilization that supposedly couldn't grow enough corn to fill a bucket. Ask yourself why a granary would be built with 5-foot thick walls of precision cut basalt. Ask yourself why the windows are aligned to the rays of Sirius with an accuracy of within 1%. Not this shelter, not that storage, something else, an observatory transmitter network that was silenced when the standardized history was enforced. I tracked the standardization of geological time to a series of lectures given at the Smithsonian in 1905. Before this date, the textbooks used in the rural academies spoke of a rapid stratification event, a polite term for a global inundation of silt and clay. After 1905, the narrative shifted to millions of years of gradual erosion. This was the intellectual pivot point of the Great Reset. If you make the mud layer millions of years old, you make the buried buildings anomalies or geological oddities. If you admit the mud arrived in 1848, you have to explain where the cities went. I found a letter from a disgraced geologist, Dr. Aris Thorne, Josiah's brother, who claimed that the red beds of the West were not iron oxide deposits, but the pulverized remains of a brick civilization that had been subjected to a high-frequency atmospheric discharge. He called it the Great Liquefaction. He was stripped of his tenure, and his books were pulled from the university libraries. The schools were the primary agents of this chronological gaslighting. They taught the children that the mountains were eternal, when in fact, the mountains were the rubble of the world that came before. The architecture of the New World capitals, with their massive domes and gold-plated finials, serves a dual purpose. It is both a monument to the conquerors and a functional piece of stolen hardware. I gained access to the maintenance tunnels beneath the California State Capitol, a building officially completed in 1874 by pioneer labor. The foundation stones are massive pink granite blocks that bear no tool marks. They appear to have been moulded like clay. Embedded within the granite are copper conduits the size of a man's thigh, leading nowhere and connected to nothing. The official blueprints label them as experimental ventilation. This is institutional gatekeeping at its most transparent. You do not use high-grade conductive copper for ventilation in a horse and buggy era. These buildings were the regional hubs for the etheric grid. The Tartarian curriculum was suppressed because it explained how these domes collected the static charge of the atmosphere to provide light, heat, and propulsion. When the bankers seized the grid, they grounded the buildings, turning the power plants into offices for tax collectors. They took the crown jewels and used them as paperweights. The orphan trains and the foundling hospitals were the demographic cleanup crew for the Great Reset. I found a ledger in an abandoned Methodist mission in Kansas that listed the intake of children from the Chicago region in 1872, immediately following the Great Fire. The children weren't listed by name, but by aptitude and memory retention. Those who remembered the wireless age were sent to specialized labor camps in the north. Those who were young enough to be reprogrammed were sent to the farms. This was the redistribution of human capital. The schools in the West were designed as primary processing centers. They were the filters through which the survivors of the old world had to pass to become citizens of the new one. The teachers were the wardens. I found a directive from the 1880s stating that no child shall speak of the skyships or the internal light under penalty of isolation. They were literally beating the memory of a high-tech civilization out of the next generation. What if the unruly child of the 19th century was simply a child who refused to lie about what they saw? I followed the trail of the sky ships to the wreckage of a World's Fair pavilion in St. Louis. The official history says these were follies, mere decorations for the 1904 exposition, but the photographic evidence shows massive, rigid hull dirigibles that didn't use hydrogen or helium. They were silent. They were heavy. They used vril, or vacuum energy, propulsion, the very thing the schools were ordered to stop teaching. I found a patent from 1898 for a buoyancy nullification drive that was filed by a teacher at a Tartarian academy. The patent was bought by a subsidiary of the Standard Oil Company and never seen again. This is the erasure trope in action. They didn't just hide the ships, they hid the physics. They forced us onto the ground, into cars and trains that require the burning of fossil fuels. They turned us from a three-dimensional species into a two-dimensional one. Not this mobility, not that freedom. Something else. A tethered existence in a world of artificial borders. The Great Reset was not just a physical event, it was a linguistic one. I analysed the shift in the English language between 1850 and 1920. Thousands of words related to etheric arts and resonance science simply disappeared from the common lexicon. They were replaced by technical, dry terms that stripped the magic from the world. The schools were the front lines of this semantic warfare. They taught the children that aura was a metaphor and that vibration was just a sound wave. They flattened the language so that we could no longer even describe the reality we were seeing. If you don't have a word for the energy coming off a cathedral spire, you stop seeing the energy, you only see the spire. This is the ultimate form of control. If you control the language, you control the boundaries of thought. The Grand Tartary was not just a place, it was a state of mind that could perceive the invisible. When the schools stopped teaching the language, the state of mind collapsed. In the final archive of the Thorn Papers, located in a lead-lined box in the sub-cellar of a demolished courthouse, I found the Code of the Reset. It was a series of instructions for the regional governors on how to handle the residual structures. It stated, where the stone is too large to move, bury it. Where the dome is too bright to hide, rename it. Where the children are too wise to fool, replace them. This was the blueprint for the world we live in. We are the replaced. We are the generation that grew up in the buried world. I realized then that the Tartaria mystery is not about a lost empire in Russia. It is about the lost empire of the human potential. The schools were the gatekeepers who told us the gate was a wall. They told us the basement was the foundation. They told us the silence was the truth. The unresolved, philosophical open loop of this investigation is the awakening of the brick. Across the globe, the red brick buildings are beginning to fail in strange ways. The mortar is dissolving, revealing copper mesh where there should be sand. The buried windows are leaking a blue light during a geomagnetic storms. The reset is wearing thin. The standardized narrative is like a coat of paint on a crumbling wall, and the true color is showing through. We are the investigators who have stayed in the basement too long. We have seen the ledgers. We have traced the conduits. We have heard the hum. The question is no longer what happened, but What now? If the schools were ordered to stop teaching the truth, who will be the ones to start? The 10th part of this narrative concludes with a vision of the Grand Tartary, not as a ghost, but as a seed. The architecture is still here. The energy is still in the air. The ether did not go anywhere. We were just taught to stop breathing it. The investigator's task is to provide the vocabulary for the next generation, to tell them that the school they attend is not a building, but a machine, to tell them that the history they learn is not a record, but a cage, to tell them that the Grand Tartary is not a memory of the past, but a promise of the future. The investigation is not over. It has merely changed hands. I have found the ledgers. I have found the conduits. Now you must find the switch. Ask yourself, if the world is a battery, what are you waiting for? The resonance did not stop at the desert's edge. It bled into the very soil of the heartland, where the land-grant universities were established atop the exact coordinates of the old world centres of learning. Found a collection of soil samples from a decommissioned campus in Ohio, sealed in jars dated 1913. When subjected to a simple electromagnetic field, the dirt began to self-organize into geometric lattices, the same star-fort patterns I had seen in the suppressed maps. The schools were ordered to stop teaching the living earth theory because the ground itself was an active participant in the civilization's energy grid. The institutional gatekeeping of the 20th century didn't just target history, it targeted the very dirt beneath our feet. They paved over the laden jars of the earth with asphalt and called it infrastructure. Ask yourself why the most fertile lands in the world are also the sites of the most massive abandoned stone structures. Not this agriculture, not that development, something else. A harvest of energy that we have been taught to call the seasons. I trace the erasure trope into the realm of the Great White North, where the maps of the 1840s depicted a lush, temperate coastline where we are told only ice has ever existed. The schools in the Canadian territories were the most isolated and therefore the most vulnerable to the curriculum purge. I discovered a series of photographs from a remote mission school showing children playing among the remains of massive palm leaf-shaped iron pillars that had been quarantined by the military in 1921. The official narrative says these were remnants of a failed telegraph experiment. The investigator sees the truth. They were heaters. They were the atmospheric regulators that maintained the climate of the Grand Tartary. When the schools stopped teaching the science of climate stabilization, the regulators failed. The Little Ice Age was not a natural cycle. It was the result of a deliberate sabotage of the planetary thermostat. We are told the North is a wasteland because they don't want us to see the ruins of the paradise they extinguished. The linear timeline requires a beginning and an end, but the architecture of the old schools suggests a cycle. I investigated the deep basements of the Ivy League, where the foundations go down 12 stories into the bedrock. In the lowest levels of a library at Yale, I found a stone tablet that didn't use letters but waveforms. It was a sonic record of the 1850 reset. It described a world where the schools were not places of instruction but places of correction, where the frequency of the human body was tuned to the frequency of the star. The Grand Tartary was a civilization of health. Disease was a dissonance that could be cured by walking through the right doorway. When the schools were ordered to stop teaching harmonic medicine, they replaced it with the germ theory of the late 19th century. They turned our bodies into battlegrounds so they could sell us the weapons. Not this health, not that science, something else, a state of perpetual biological static. The Great Reset involved the Systematic destruction of the old world libraries, but they couldn't burn it all. Some of it was digitized by the very systems designed to replace it. I found a glitch in a National Archive database that allowed me to access a series of restricted architectural scans. These scans revealed that the domes of the state capitals are not solid. They are hollow, containing intricate clockwork mechanisms made of an unknown non-oxidizing alloy. These are the etheric accumulators. They were designed to draw power from the ionosphere and distribute it to the surrounding red brick schools. The schools were the substations of the old world. This is why they are spaced so perfectly across the landscape. They were the nodes of a global brain. Institutional gatekeeping ensures that we see these domes as symbols of democracy, while they continue to hum silently, drawing power that is now diverted to the secret bunkers of the elite. What if your city is still on, but you are just not allowed to plug in? The orphan trains left a trail of silence that I followed to the coastal cities of the West. In San Francisco, I found records of the Midwinter Fair of 1894, another temporary city built of plaster that contained a tower of light 300 feet tall. This tower didn't use filaments, it used a glowing gas that the textbooks of the time called the breath of the world. After the fair, the tower was dismantled and the gas was declared poisonous by the newly formed health boards. The schools were ordered to stop teaching the chemistry of the breath. They replaced it with the study of combustion. They taught us to burn things: wood, coal, oil, gas. They turned us into pyromaniacs in a world that was designed to be powered by light. This is the ultimate reset. They took a civilization that lived on the interest of the Earth's energy and forced it to spend the principle. They turned us into cosmic spendthrifts so we would always be in debt to the providers of the flame. I moved my investigation to the great reset of the visual arts. Before 1880, the paintings of the old world depicted a sky that was not blue, but a shimmering opalescent violet. The schools were ordered to stop teaching chromatic realism and instead taught that the artists of the past were simply idealizing the sky. But the chemical analysis of the pigments suggests otherwise. They were painting what they saw. The sky changed. The atmospheric resonance that the Tartarians tapped into gave the atmosphere a different refractive index. When the grid was grounded, the sky died into the blue we see today. The schools were the primary tools of this visual indoctrination. They taught us to accept the dullness as the natural state. They blinded us to the glory of the past by telling us our ancestors were imaginative rather than observant. Not this sky, not that light, something else, a dimming of the world's radiance to match the dimming of our minds. In the final, most hidden part of the Thorn Papers, Josiah spoke of the quiet room. This was a space located in the center of every Tartarian school where no sound from the outside could penetrate. It wasn't for study, it was for direct knowing. He wrote that in the quiet room, a child could see the entire history of the human race, not as a series of dates, but as a single unfolding flower. The schools were ordered to stop using the quiet rooms in 1895. They were turned into closets or demolished to make way for standardized hallways. This was the final blow. They took away our ability to see the truth for ourselves and made us dependent on the approved narrative. They replaced knowing with learning. They replaced the flower with the staircase. Institutional gatekeeping is not just about the information, it is about the method of perception. If you can't go into the quiet room, you have to listen to the teacher, and the teacher has been told to lie. The Unresolved philosophical open loop of this investigative essay is the return of the signal. Across the globe, people are reporting a hum in their ears, a ringing that matches the resonant frequency of the old red brick schools. The reset is failing because the earth is waking up. The standardized world is a thin veneer of noise, and the deep, silent song of the Grand Tartary is beginning to break through. We are the generation that was supposed to be the blank slate, but the slate is not blank, it is etched with the ghosts of 1,000 star cities. The schools are struggling to keep the children in their seats because the children can hear the hum. They can see the violet in the sky. They are starting to ask the questions that Josiah Thorne was killed for asking. The investigation is not over because the truth is not a thing you find. It is a thing you become. I sat on the steps of an abandoned academy as the sun set, the red bricks glowing like embers in the twilight. Realised that the Grand Tartary never really went away. It was just ordered to stop. But you cannot order the wind to stop. You cannot order the earth to stop. You can only order the people to stop looking. And the people are starting to look again. They are looking at the buried windows. They are looking at the meaningless domes. They are looking at each other and realizing that they are not orphans, but heirs. The Great Reset was a pause, not an end. The investigation leads to a single provocative point. The forbidden knowledge is not a secret, it is a memory, and memories cannot be bricked up forever. What if the next reset is the one where we remember everything?